Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted this Rubicon Willys MB Jeep. Some say it is actually pronounced Willis, but then I can't chuckle to myself about Willys. Willys. Anyway, this is a plastic 28mm scale model and I built it according to Rubicon's instructions for the British airborne Jeep. I know the result will give some rivet counters a heart attack, but I don't care. If you want to see the build video, there's a link in the description, and in the upper right corner of the screen now. So let's get to painting. As is often the case, I primed the model black. I used the Stynel Res Black primer here, and as you can hopefully see, I've glued the model to a popsicle stick. I base coat the Jeep using Vallejo model colour Olive Grey. Obviously I'm airbrushing this, and so I've thinned it enough to go through the airbrush. I apply it in a couple of thin coats. I'm sure there's someone who will say this is the wrong colour, but they're wrong because this is my model and I like the way it looks. I then apply a highlight. I airbrush this from above and very slightly to the sides of the model. This is a mix of roughly 1/4 Vallejo model colour buff to 3/4 olive grey. I add a further highlight using the same colours, though this time they were mixed closer to 50-50. I try not to go too heavy with either of these highlights, but I think maybe I did go a little bit too heavily. Oh well, I add some more highlights anyway, this time with a brush. This is roughly 2 parts olive grey to 1.5 parts buff. I was kind of eyeballing it. It actually looks almost like a pastel green. It's not quite as light as the previous airbrushed highlights, but brushing it on does seem to make it a bit more opaque. As you can see, I apply this along all of the edges and corners of the Jeep to try and make them stand out a little bit, and for that it does seem to work pretty well. It's not over the top and looks decent enough to me, but the overall colour seems to be a little bit too light. To deal with that, I applied a wash of Secret Weapon Green Black, hoping that it will darken things down a bit and look a bit more like I want it to. I diluted this roughly 3 parts green black wash to 1 part water, and I brushed it all over the Jeep. This is a pretty good wash, though it does seem to bubble up very easily. I'm not sure how to prevent that really. I'm sure those bubbles would dry and leave odd looking tide marks which will look a little bit weird, so I either blow on the bubbles or poke at them with my brush to get rid of them. The result is pretty much what I wanted. It's darkened everything down, added a bit more depth, and the highlights are still visible through it. Though I thought maybe it would look good if I added some more highlights just to bring out the edges a tiny bit more, so I dry brush on a mix of roughly 50-50 olive grey and buff. I dry brush this on pretty much exactly the same way as the previous dry brushing. It is after all intended to highlight the same things. I do try to go fairly lightly with this because the colour I mixed will look much lighter after the green-black wash was added. I didn't want to make it stand out too much. Subtlety is what I'm going for. I think it ended up looking pretty decent. Up to this point the model was painted pretty much the same way as the Firefly I did a while ago. I did paint them up till this point at the same time. If you haven't already seen the Firefly painting video, there's a link in the description and in the upper right corner of the screen now. As for this Jeep, it's time for decals. Prior to applying these I put gloss varnish in the areas that I want to add markings. The first decal I applied was I think it's a bridging weight indicator. It's a yellow disc with numbers, and I applied it over the headlight. I had seen this on some Jeeps, including the painted example on Rubicon's website, and I thought it looked kind of interesting. It was a little bit tricky to get it into this position, but I did get it in there eventually. I also added a number to the side of the hood. It was almost a disaster on the right side, but I did manage to save it. I'm pretty sure the M marks this as a British vehicle. It should probably be blue if it's an airborne Jeep, but let's just pretend that it is. I didn't feel like spending the time and effort to find blue numbers. I also added a star to the rear sides of the Jeep like so. I didn't feel like adding the big star to the centre of the hood. It is almost always there, but I have seen pictures of Jeeps without it, so I chose not to add it. This model isn't based on any specific Jeep, so that's fine. I'm the only one that it has to please anyway, so if it upsets you, deal with it, I guess. Chipping is next. I use a roughed up piece of foam to apply a mix of roughly 60% model colour black grey to about 40% model colour mahogany. I also added a tiny bit of London grey just to see how that would look. As usual, I'm very rough and imprecise in the mixing of colours for chipping. I made a video covering this technique in a little bit more depth, so if you want to see that, there's a link in the description and in the upper right corner of the screen now. Once I'm done with that, it's time to paint the tyres. The reason for doing the chipping before the tyres and other details like the seats or gun is because I don't want chipping on those parts. Painting them after the chipping means I don't need to be so careful with the sponge, and I don't need to touch up the areas I didn't want chipping on. It's always good to think about your order of operations to save time. Painting the tyres is pretty easy. The main trick is not painting the areas that aren't tyre, though I'm sure you don't really need me to tell you that. The colour I'm using to paint the tyres is AK Interactive Rubber Tyres, which seemed appropriate. I got it from the AK Interactive Tracks and Wheels set. I've had that sitting around for a while and I figured it might be worth trying some of those colours out. This paint is quite thin out of the bottle, which isn't a bad thing. It does mean that you'll need to do a couple of coats though. I think it's quite a good colour for tyres. Of course, don't forget to paint any spare tyres, and the insides of the tyre too. They might be visible at some point and you do want them to look very tyre from all angles. Next, I get out the good old Vallejo Black Grey. With this I paint the foot pedals. They're a bit fiddly so you'd be forgiven for omitting them. I also paint the gear shifter this colour. I don't know if it should be this colour or not, but I feel like this adds a little bit of interest and makes it stand out a bit. It is also a little bit fiddly, but if you go slowly and carefully it should be fine. Looks reasonable to me. At this point I was considering whether or not I should paint the details on the dashboard, but I didn't really feel like it. There's not much there anyway. Next, using the same colour, I paint the steering wheel. This is obviously pretty simple. The goal is to get the grey paint on the steering wheel. Good times. I wasn't entirely sure if the steering column should also be grey or not, but in a lot of the pictures I saw it looks as though it was left green, and I figured that was good enough for me, so I left it. Just to add a little bit of interest, I also painted the antenna mounds. It should probably be some sort of dark colour anyway. Then I paint the machine gun, making sure not to also paint the ammo box. There's nothing especially tricky about this, simply put the paint on the gun and not the non-gun bits. That said, I wasn't entirely sure how far the green should go on the mounting, and I think I did paint some of the mount grey, but I don't think it really matters a whole lot. All of the rivet counters probably died back when I was doing the decals anyway. What matters is the gun isn't green. Then I paint the seats. I decided to use Vallejo model colour Iraqi Sand for this. I wasn't entirely sure what sort of colour these should be. Initially I considered doing them in a sort of leathery colour, but maybe that would be a bit too much of a luxury for a vehicle like this. In the colour photos I could find, and pictures of restored vehicles, they're somewhere between a dirty white or maybe a very light khaki to a tan. I didn't really want to spend hours reading through arguments about which colour is right, so I just chose something that looks okay to me. It's going to be discoloured and made dirty with weathering anyway. I tried to apply this fairly neatly, and not get it on the chair framey bits. It does look a little bit messy at the moment, but I'm hoping to neaten that up later with some washes. Then I move on to the tools on the left side of the Jeep. I painted the wooden handles with Vallejo model colour Beige Brown. I just like using this colour for wood. I think it looks nice. There's not really much to this. I'm using a fine brush and carefully applying the paint to the handles. It would be easy enough to correct mistakes on the metal parts of the tools. I'll be painting them next. Getting a spill onto the green would be a bit more annoying, so I'm trying to avoid that. Then, as I said I would, I paint the metal parts of the tools. I decided to try Vallejo model colour Gunmetal Grey for this. This is a metallic paint, and I generally don't like using metallics for this kind of thing, but I figured why not try it out. It seemed like it would be pretty dark and not stand out too much. I apply this carefully, same as the wood colour. I think this would be even more annoying to remove from the green areas. I had to apply 2 coats of this to get decent enough coverage. I think it looks okay. I think it would look better with some washes to darken it down a bit more, but that comes later. Then I decided it would be fun to paint the jerrican a different colour. I chose model colour Brown Violet. I figured this might add a little bit of interest and spice up the rear of the Jeep. Again, like the tools, the trick is to avoid getting the paint on the main body of the Jeep. It made sense to me that the little shelf thing that the jerrican sits on should be the Jeep's main colour. At this point it stands out a bit, but it'll blend in more as it gets weathered. In my quest to add more interest, I decided painting the frame and suspension parts to look rusty was a good idea. I don't think I was wrong. For this, I used Vallejo model colour Mahogany Brown. These parts are obviously not made of mahogany or any kind of wood, unless you count steel as wood, in which case I have questions. I think this colour is a pretty good base for rusty things though, that's why I use it. I certainly could have gotten away without doing this. I mean, the underside of the Jeep isn't exactly visible, but I thought it might add a nice touch, even if it's only very rarely seen. Time to add some washes. First, I apply army painted dark tone to the steering wheel. I do this fairly heavily and I haven't diluted the dark tone at all. I want it to be pretty dark in the areas I'm applying it. The next area being the metal parts of the tools. It's okay if a little bit of this spills off of the tool parts and onto the green. It should cause a sort of shadowy look, which I think is good, but I don't want too much of that. Too much would look kind of messy. I also apply this to the machine gun. Again, all over the gun, but not the ammo box. I just want to darken the gun down in general, and add a bit of depth to the recesses and such. Pretty simple stuff really. I continue using the dark tone, but now I've thinned it roughly 50-50 with water and I paint the interior floor of the Jeep with it. I figure the floors should be pretty dirty and worn, and this should help create that look. It's a bit fiddly to get it around the front seats without accidentally hitting the seats, but it can obviously be done. Then I figure why not use this wash to add a little bit of depth and interest to the tyres and wheels. This is fairly light. I don't really want to change the colour of the wheels too much, but a little variation can't hurt. And then, why not keep on with this mix and apply it to the leaf springs and frame parts to darken those down and add some shadow. There's no need to be too neat under the body here. Next, I apply undiluted Army Painter Strong Tone to the wooden tool handles. It doesn't impart a wood grain to them or anything fancy like that, but it does improve their appearance a little bit. Then, I dilute the strong tone to a roughly 50-50 mix with water, and apply it to the seats to make them look a bit dirty. I went pretty heavily with this, so these seats are going to look pretty dirty and well used, which I don't think is a bad thing. I also focused this pretty heavily around the edges of the seats to try and hide some of the messiness I made with the Iraqi Sand. We'll see how effective that is when it dries. I also applied this to the jerrican, just to blend it in with the rest of the Jeep and add some depth to its gaps. Then I dry brushed the machine gun and steering wheel. At first I tried plain model colour black grey, but I didn't feel like it was quite light enough, so I quickly made a mix of roughly 50-50 black grey and model colour London grey. I probably could have used basalt grey or something like that though. Either way, I just lightly apply this second colour to the machine gun and steering wheel. All I really want is the edges and raised bits of those parts to stand out just a little bit more, and I think what I've done was effective. I then applied a coat of gloss varnish. I'm not going to use enamels just yet. I wanted to try the AK Interactive Dry Light Mud, also from the Track and Wheels box, and I figured the varnish would make this a bit easier to clean up if I made mistakes or just didn't like it. I start by mixing the Dry Light Mud roughly 50-50 with Vallejo airbrush thinner. Then I lightly brush it into the treads of the tyres, and even lighter on the sides of the tyres. The idea is obviously to reflect dried mud in those areas, but I don't want it to be too heavy. I also figure I might as well try adding this to the body in areas around the wheels, because it might look a bit silly to have the tyres be all dusty with no evidence of dust on the body. I apply it fairly messily, and then I dip my brush in water and spread the colour out a bit more. It's actually kind of similar to how I use enamels. I left it to dry and it looks okay, but it's much harder to see than I was expecting. The glossiness also kind of makes it a bit harder to see here than in real life. However, I do want it to be a little bit heavier, and now I feel a bit more comfortable in applying the Dry Light Mud a bit heavier. This application is pretty much the same as before, just heavier. I quite like this colour so far, and I think it's going to be a useful paint in the future. I was happy enough with that, so I applied another coat of gloss varnish to seal it all in. Time for enamels. First I apply AK Interactive Rust streaks to the rusty areas on the underside of the Jeep. Quite obviously I'm not streaking this, but it works fine just as a rusty coloured paint anyway. I apply this pretty heavily and then I take a brush with clean thinner on it to roughly thin out the paint a bit more in random places. Over that, before it even dries, I apply tiny bits of AK Interactive Light Rust Enamel Wash. I add a few spots of this to the frame and leaf springs. I just want to use this to add some variation and interest to the rusty colour. I also apply this around the bolty bits of the spare wheel. This probably shouldn't be too rusty, but I just wanted to have some rust. Just a hint. So I use a brush with clean thinner to remove most of the rust. It looks decent enough, but while looking at it and pondering, I figured the jerrican could do with a bit of highlighting. I did this with the brown violet that I base coated it with. I just wanted the edges all around the jerrican to stand out just a little bit more. Nothing too fancy here, though it is fairly effective. After that, I applied another layer of gloss varnish in preparation for the final weathering. I don't think it really needs too much, but I do apply some AK Interactive dark brown enamel for green vehicles. You might be surprised to learn that this is indeed a green vehicle. I just applied this to a couple of areas, like the gun mounting pole and around the hubs of the wheels. I figured those areas would be kind of dirty. I don't want them to be too dirty though, so I use a brush with clean thinner on it to remove a lot of the wash. It should look fairly subtle when it's finished. The floor wasn't looking quite dark enough for my liking, so I apply the enamel wash in there too. Pretty much like I did here earlier with the acrylic wash. Then, dust. I spray AK Interactive Summer Kursk Earth. This is thinned something like 1 part Kursk Earth to 5 parts thinner, though very imprecisely measured. I spray this in short bursts. I want this to be very light and subtle. The idea is that there should just be a hint of dust, just to kind of blend in with the dried mud I put on the wheels earlier. I think I succeeded here. The dust is really light. To finish off, I applied a coat of AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. I think the result is quite good. Like I said earlier, it's never going to meet the approval of rivet counters or anything like that. To be fair, airborne Jeeps do tend to look a little bit different to mine, and maybe have a bit more stowage, but the model meets my approval and that's what matters. I'm rather pleased. Now my British Command Squad has another option for their transport. Instead of using a Bren carrier, they can now zip around in this Jeep. I guess other small squads can use it too, if they ask nicely. I don't really know how a Jeep plays in bolt action, but I'm sure it's pretty useful. Either as a little transport or just as another machine gun. I think I'm going to need as many shooty boys as I can get when I eventually play against Barnaby and his Germans. I'm getting closer and closer to being able to field a fully painted British army, which is pretty cool. Just a few more models to go and I'll be able to field a fully painted army list with a bit of flexibility. And obviously that means I'm more likely to win, because painted models fight better. Everyone knows that. Anyway, I rather enjoyed painting this model. It's something a little different to a tank while still being similar. I really do enjoy painting vehicles more than other things. It didn't really take me a whole lot of time to paint this, partly because I doubled up painting the base coats at the same time as the Firefly I did a while ago, and partly, I guess, because it's just not a very big vehicle, and it doesn't really have a lot of details needing attention. I didn't do anything revolutionary or tricky in this video, but hopefully you've picked up something that you can use in your own painting. I do like to encourage people to make their own colour choices when painting, but if you want to paint one of these using the same colours that I did, there's a list of paints used in the description below. Of course, you're free to use any colours that you want, be that hot pink or colours you've painstakingly researched. You do you. So, what do you think? I'm always happy to receive constructive criticism and input. Of course, keep in mind that I really don't care that I didn't paint the Jeep in whatever shade you believe is historically accurate, and rivet counters will either be ignored or mocked, but do let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you haven't already, why not sub here on YouTube, follow me on social media, or watch me stream on Twitch. And if you really like what I do, please consider supporting over on Patreon, or perhaps by purchasing a mug or shirt from my merch store. Links to all of those things are in the description below. And as always, I shall return soon, so until then, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.